So, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transportation, or in this case, urbanization, because there's often a trope that certain places are so dense that they're like a city, or sometimes they are said to be cities and they're not, and this is gonna apply to some cases in developing countries, but it's going to mostly apply to questions of either distinct cities that are very close, that are closely spaced, or high background densities, and there's also going to be an issue of refugee camps. The motive, and I'm going to talk about refugee camps for a second, just because the motivating example was some throwaway comment in a blog about very different things, about something about Gaza, where something about about what it meant that Gaza was urban, and it didn't sit quite right with me. Now, I'm not talking about like the war, but just but that specific line made me think more about how people think that Gaza and many other places that are usually not war zones are more urban than they actually are. So what I mean by density without urbanization is, look at where I'm hovering now. So there are these three Indian states, which are Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and West Bengal, which are all dense, and I mean like 1,000 people per square kilometers. That's like if it's listed Indian states, big population. That should have the density, yeah. So, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal. So combined, I think they would average out to be a little bit less than 1,000. And Bangladesh itself is also about there. I think it's about 1,000 as well. Yeah, this is Bangladesh, by far the most densely populated country that is not small. I think it's over 10 million people or something like that. And just to put things in perspective, not the Los Angeles class submarines, but the county. LA County is this. So in theory, we have 500 million people across two countries that are pretty contiguous, living at the density of Los Angeles County. And Los Angeles County is highly urban, and I mean it's also highly suburban, but it is part of one very large metropolitan area, and this is emphatically not that at all. And so that's going to be one of the examples. Another, and before I hovered on North India and Bangladesh, I hovered here and here because I want to make it clear that it's not just a developing country issue, because the Netherlands has the same issue of very high background density, and to some extent Noordrijn-Westfalen. Now Noordrijn-Westfalen, about 500 per square kilometer, but at least in Noordrijn-Westfalen, you could say, the majority of this really is one metro area because of the Rhine-Ruhr. It's about 2/3, maybe a little less than 2/3 of the state's population. And I don't think there's any sense in which Bielefeld is part of like the same metropolitan area as Dortmund, Essen, Düsseldorf, Köln, Bonn, but again, 2/3 of the state's population is us. But the Netherlands is another really good example because that's not LA County density, but what else is there? Okay, so Harris County is another 1,000. Maybe Dallas and Tarrant County are less. I mean, there are American metro areas that are like 400. So Dallas County is a little more than 1,000, but with Tarrant County, and then with all the surrounding counties, so Plano, things like that, which I guess would be Denton County. I think that's Collin County, I think is where Plano is. Yeah. Like, this is very urban. I mean, suburban sprawl, but that is urban, but by any functional definition of city. And now the Netherlands is about the same density. Thank you, McAfee. But I would not call it one city. I don't think anyone would call it one city. So this is the Netherlands. So it's the same as North Rhine-Westphalia, and it's so the Netherlands, of course, highly urbanized, which I mean, basically everyone in the Netherlands is urban, but it's all one city. I mean, Randstad has elements of one polycentric city, but again, Groningen, Eindhoven, 's-Hertogenbosch are not part of that. And because I was trying to cover like this, that's because the end of this is the southwestern Levant. It's something that affects both Israel and Palestine. So Gaza is dense, and I don't mean like dense by the way. Gaza is a lot denser than that. Gaza is about the same population density as Philadelphia. To the point that you can almost portray it as one city, but it isn't. So, of course, all of this is pre-war, but pre-war, there were still gaps in urbanization. And again, I mean, you can portray Gaza. Gaza City is a city. Again, all pre-war. And I mean, Khan Yunis and Rafah, but they're small cities. Maybe Gaza is medium size. It's just a lot of density, but no urban function. Israel itself, I mean, Israel is very dense. Israel is one of the densest countries in the world. The number on Wikipedia will be without the territories. So this is Israel proper. This is Israel proper with like this kind of population distribution. So if you just look at the coastal plain up to Haifa, and with I wouldn't say tentacle up to Jerusalem, but that tentacle is literally called the routes that were conquered by Israel during the 1948 war. That's about 1,000. That's really dense. And I mean, yeah, Israel is a very urban country, but again, there's a sense in which, roughly from Ashdod-ish, or even a bit farther south to Netanya, it's one metro area. There's no sense in which this and this are the same metro area. There's no sense in which Tel Aviv and Haifa are the same metro area, or Tel Aviv and Beersheba. So this is density in the sense of cities that are in close proximity to each other, but it's not fusing into one city. And again, the density in Israel, excluding anything south of Beersheba, that's going to be again LA County, Harris County, Dallas County, that kind of density. So to talk about this a little more, I want to kind of zoom back. You don't zoom back, you zoom out. I want to zoom out and talk about what it means to be urban, because it is not just density. It is several things, of which some level of density is one, but I emphasize some, because background rural density in certain places like Bangladesh or the Gangetic Plain in India does overlap with suburban density in very sprawly American metro areas. And in the United States, to be an urban area, I think the core needs to be minimum 1,000 per square mile. Like, not average over the core. I think it's the outermost part, and then you're allowed to have peripheries down to, I think, 500 per square mile. So 1,000 per square mile is about a little less than 400 per square kilometer. And again, there are countries that are denser than that. And I don't mean city-states. I mean the Netherlands, Israel, maybe Belgium. And Japan is, I think, not that much less sense in that. And but I guess in Japan in Japan there are gaps in urbanization because of the mountains between Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kanshin. And so anyway, with urbanity, what it means is it's about function. This is why you can try to measure the size of an urban area through contiguous urbanization, but usually national agencies prefer metropolitan areas, which are defined functionally, usually through commuting. So in the US or in Japan or in France, the definition is through commuting. In Germany, the definition is more arbitrary, and often the conception is based on public transportation, fare zones, or if you will, the Verkehrsverbund, which is kind of no longer a thing because of the 49 euro ticket, but I think that's still partly managed with Verkehrsverbund, and certainly it was a thing until 2022. And so it's so the centrality of this is people working in different different fields or different things that take them out of the local neighborhood. I mean, some places are called cities of neighborhood, and you can maybe talk about how maybe historically there would be people who would stay in the same neighborhood all their lives. There are stories about people who lived much of their lives in Brooklyn and never went to Manhattan, but that is something that was true maybe at the very end of the 19th, very beginning of the 20th century. Like, I think someone who was born 55 was telling me this about their grandparents. So there would be people who probably were born around 1900. And so that was a trope, like, very early 20th century. And I think maybe even then it was not grandparents, but great-grandparents. So many people who would have been born maybe 1880-ish. And so, but even then, I mean, Brooklyn didn't grow randomly. Brooklyn grew because of immigration to an area that was adjacent to New York. I mean, yeah, you could live your entire life without visiting Manhattan, but enough people did commute to Manhattan. That way, I mean, the L's were built partly to get people to work in downtown Brooklyn, but also partly to get ferries to Manhattan. And then bridges opened to Manhattan. Like, remember, the Brooklyn Bridge opened, I think, 1880 something, 1870 something, 1883. So yeah, the explosion of population in Brooklyn is part of the same city, even though it took until 1898 for the city to annex. And so if people just live in proximity and don't commute, I would not call that a city. I would not call it one city. It could be several cities in close proximity, which is something that, I mean, I know from experience occurs in highly densely populated countries. So let me stop talking about India for a moment. Stop talking over India for a moment. In Israel, it is pretty common to commute to Tel Aviv from surrounding areas. How far is kind of unclear. I mean, there are statistical there are statistical databases on this, but they're not very well known. Like, I don't think there's anything like the Metropolitan Statistical Area or the Area in Israel, but it goes pretty far out, like roughly as far as you would expect based on kind of eyeballing. Like, I don't know how common it is to commute from Netanya, but from Ra'anana, Herzliya, yeah, all the time. Modi'in is kind of infamous as an American-style commuter suburb, also rather rich in a country where usually the income centrality gradient is rich center, poor periphery. Not entirely, because there's also very very strong directionality. Like in Tel Aviv, it's rich north, poor south. Plus patches, like Bnei Brak is like east. You have upper middle class suburbs like Ramat Gan and Givatayim, but also Bnei Brak. Uh, but but Ashdod, again, Ashdod's more debatable because it has a lot of local employment, but people clearly do this commute. Ashdod to the Tel Aviv core, or Netanya to the Tel Aviv core, and people don't do that from farther out. It's not normal to commute from Beersheba to Tel Aviv or from Haifa to Tel Aviv. And so, yeah, Tel Aviv and Haifa, so Tel Aviv is a metro area of, it's more like 3.5-ish million, maybe more, maybe 4 million, and Jerusalem is about, it's debatable because how much of East Jerusalem you're going to count depends on functionality, but for commute functionality, East Jerusalem, I don't know what to call it, cis-mural East Jerusalem should count. By cis-mural, I mean there are some sections of East Jerusalem that are on the Palestinian side of the border wall, I think, like the Garam. But most of, not just most of the settlements, I mean most of Palestinian East Jerusalem, like the core, like the Arab core of the city is cis-mural, not transmural. So that's about 1 million. And Haifa and its Creole, and the Creole from which people absolutely do commute to Haifa, that's, I think, functional region of also like 1 million point something. And yeah, so I don't want to say what exactly the definition should be. I will tell you the American and the Japanese definitions are very different. The Japanese definition, I prefer the Japanese definition when I do Bush demography, but that's because the Japanese definition is easier to compute by hand. The Japanese definition is that a city is said to be designated if it has at least 500,000 people. It used to be also that it should have a path to 1 million, but that's no longer required. And then a designated city is allowed to have suburbs, and you're counted as a suburb of a designated city if at least 1.5% of your population aged 15 or more commutes to the central city for work or school. If two designated cities have a shared suburb in common, then they're merged into the same metropolitan area. So, for example, Tokyo. In Tokyo, what people usually mean when they call the city of Tokyo, so the 23 special wards, is counted as the city. So that, as you might imagine, shares suburbs with Yokohama or Kawasaki or Saitama or Chiba. So that's all one metro area. And I think that once it's established that it's one metro area, you're not required to be 1.5% to just one of the designated cities in the metro area, but to all of them combined. So it can cascade. The American definition is that you have the contiguous urban area, as mentioned above. The density threshold is 1,000 per square mile core, 500 per square mile periphery. And then a metropolitan statistical area is at county resolution, whether a majority of people are in the aforementioned urban area or commute to the urban area, but because you're commuting to the entire urban area, not the designated city, a much higher threshold than 1.5% is required. I think it's 40% of the economically active population, but don't quote me on that. Maybe it's 25%. Maybe it's in France. It's defined very similarly to in the United States. The density threshold is different. I think it's buildings spaced 200 meters apart. But then it is Maybe it's 40% actually. Yeah, it's 40%, and then I think the metropolitan statistical area is 50%. And I think combined statistical areas maybe 20 or 25%. So different definitions, but I have good enough commute data for the United States. I can run that I can run the Japanese definition on it, and it's basically the same as the combined statistical area. So I don't want to say what statistical definition to use, just that there are a bunch, and they seem to give fairly compatible answers. And the disagreements are in areas that are very peripheral. So the disagreement is not going to be on whether Haifa is a suburb of New York, which it is not, or whether Beersheba is a suburb, not New York, whether Haifa is a suburb of Tel Aviv, which it is not, or whether Beersheba is a suburb of Tel Aviv, which it is not, or whether Eindhoven is a suburb of Amsterdam, which again it is not, but rather about things like would you merge the New Haven and New York metropolitan areas? And of course, if you're trying to use the Japanese definition on the United States, you need to decide what is a designated city, because the United States doesn't have as much suburban annexation, not in the Northeast at least. So what counts as a designated city? Just New York, or also Newark, Jersey City, Stamford maybe? But I think the most reasonable definitions of what is a designated city would not merge New York and New Haven. But not all of them. So it's stuff on. So it's that kind of marginal things, or how much of the Poconos would you count as suburbs of New York? Like, would you count Pike County? Would you count Monroe County? So areas that, I mean, you can see on a map are not really contiguously urban, and don't self-perceive as New York. So I don't know this area well enough to even tell you whether they self-perceive in opposition to New York, the way the suburbs on Long Island and in Westchester do. I doubt that they do in like Pike County, Pennsylvania, or Monroe County, Pennsylvania. But again, functionally, this is kind of like the outer reach of the New York region. The same is maybe true of secondary cities that definitively fell into the orbit, so not some stuff that probably would not count, like New Haven, but Trenton you should count. But again, different city core. Do people do the commute? Yes, they do. Maybe not from Trenton proper, but I think from Princeton they do, or from like suburbs around Princeton, and they do to New York and Trenton. So this is what I mean by this is kind of like complex urbanity or metropolitanity, in that the job specialization in New York is such that people do the commute from quite a long ways away. And that's not something that we see in the Netherlands at the scale of the entire country. And because the Netherlands is not economically complex, it's a very rich country. I don't know GDP per hour numbers for metropolitan areas. And a quick reminder that GDP includes corporate HQs, which means that metropolitan scale GDP per capita is always fake news. But at per capita income level, I mean, yeah, okay, the Netherlands is slightly poorer than the United States, mostly due to working hours. Okay, it's poorer than New York. It's not even that much poorer than LA. I don't think LA is significantly richer than the rest of the United States. And it obviously does exert community influence to a long distance, but the Netherlands would be is a place where there's just a lot of cities that are close together. And sure, maybe if you had American norms about how far you'd be willing to commute, you can absolutely do a super commute to Amsterdam from most other places in the country. But it's not done. You don't need to. Israel is the same. There's this book that I read many years ago, like 20 plus years ago, which was essentially the memoir of an American Jewish immigrant to Israel, who talked about how, based on like American norms, they knew that they were getting work in Tel Aviv, so they drove an hour out and decided to commute from like almost Haifa. Again, it would not be from Haifa proper because you don't need to. I mean, if you want to live in a city, you can just live in Tel Aviv. Yeah, it's more expensive than Haifa, but I'm not even sure it is net of commute costs, and you can find other cities that are closer. So if you're from here, it's like Trenton, New York. I mean, if you want to live in Trenton, you can live in the Bronx. So the commutes are usually not Trenton to New York. It's wealthy suburbs of Trenton that are also the wealthy suburbs of New York. And again, I'm forgetting what, maybe Zichron, but like something that was almost Haifa, and that was very much a fish out of water story. Again, can you do it? Yes, this guy did. It's just not normal. Why would you do that to yourself? You don't need to do that. You can, I mean, if you want to place if you want a place that's like Zichron, there are other places that are closer to Tel Aviv that are like that. And like it's not that specialized. And so again, this is a highly urban country. Of course, in the same way that I just mentioned before, that there's this anti-New York identity in its suburbs, at least its in-state ones. There is an anti-urban identity in parts of Israel that are not cities as they self-perceive. So this can come from, in the Jewish sector, two places. I don't know to what extent that exists as an identity in the Arab sector, but in the Jewish sector, this would come from two places. The first is the kibbutz movement. People will say, "Oh, I don't want to live in a city," so they live in either a kibbutz or a moshav or a gated community that is neither of these things, but imitates the gatedness, which is called a community town, where you need to get permission to live there. Like you need to appear in front of a board which will ask you questions like levy from where, just to make sure that the levy in question would be from the right places, like maybe the levy comes from Lithuania or Ukraine and not Morocco. But these areas are entirely urban, and this includes the kibbutzes. Like the kibbutz, yeah, I mean it exists as like a tight-knit community, but at this point, people commute out. So one, I mean, it gets to the point that I know. So I don't know personally anyone who lived in any of the kibbutzes that were raided on the 7th of October. I did not know well, but I knew people who lived in one of them, but died of old age before the war. I don't know if that one, a great uncle of mine, commuted or something, but I know that other people did. This was something that was done. Like maybe not the ones that are like in the Gaza envelope because they're kind of far, but kibbutzes that are closer to the center, people absolutely do that commute. Or often the kibbutz would own industrial land adjacent to a small city, and develop that, and essentially live as rentiers. So that's the first kind of places that are in practice pretty metropolitan, but pretend they're not. And the second is development towns, which are the working class version of this, which is towns that were built, like Sderot, for example. Sderot, Netivot, Ofakim, it's like areas that are new towns that were plopped up at kind of random places in the periphery of the country. They're less urban in the sense that they don't have this metropolitanness. They're not usually commuter suburbs or something. Like people don't usually do the commute. They have high unemployment. So they're like little towns. Some of them are urban. Some of the development towns are urban. If they're again close to something. To the extent you can do the commute. There's even this point of rail line that instead of going Tel Aviv, Beersheva, the normal, which is like this, they're building ones going like this to develop these areas, but I don't know to what extent people ride it at all, especially because the train doesn't actually go into the city. Like, this is where the train is. Uh, and so again, some of these I would not really call urban, but some of them are. But they have kind of the same, uh, the same kind of idea that urban means Tel Aviv. But fundamentally, this is a metropolitan country. Again, not entirely, but supermajority. And uh, but it's again a bunch of different cities. Um, Again, it's mostly Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, and Beersheba, and their various spheres of influence. And uh, and again, you can try to do an American-style analysis of density, but that would be wrong because it just doesn't cohere with how people travel or with economic specialization. Um, and that gets me to the more developing country example. And I kind of want to go into Gaza for a moment because, um, as I said, the motivating example was a throwaway comment on a coup. It's this blog by uh, the classicist and military historian Brett Devereaux, which was not the post was not about Gaza, but it was saying something about clan rule and urbanity, and said that Gaza is and said something about the urbanity of Gaza. Um, so remember, Gaza pre-war was a series of refugee camps. Uh, it did not have much of an economy. Like, yes, it had a pretty significant proportion of its population, like a couple percent, but still commute to Israel as day laborers. Uh, but it's not like Gaza was a suburb of Israel. It wasn't commuting to a specific place in Israel, just Israel writ large, and like 2 or 3%, or however many that is, to an entire country would never make a suburb. That's too loose of a connection. Remember, in Japan, it's 1.5% of the uh, age 15 or above population, which would be like, I don't know, close to 3%. No, not close to, less than that, 0.5%, 0.8% or something like that of the population of the Strip, but to a designated city, not the entire country. And these were doing working class jobs, so commuting. So an important class aspect is that commuting to the central city is usually a middle class marker, because the central city is usually where the more specialized, higher value added jobs are. And that's true even in places in the United States where the city itself is very poor. The city may be poor, but its jobs are rich. So the Gazan day laborers were disproportionately maybe not in Tel Aviv, but in all of these towns in the middle where they have people doing working class things. And so, but again, small percentage, and it's not like there's a strong commute relationship where people would regularly, commute from Khan Yunis to Gaza City. You can always crayon something like how an independent Palestine would have, or an independent or conservative Palestine would have a subway on Saladin. Like this road, like the main one through the Strip, is named after Saladin, Salahadin, I guess. People in neither Hebrew nor English say Saladin. And not neither Hebrew nor Arabic. But that's not how people actually travel, because again, it doesn't really have an economy. I mean, now there's war, but before the war, Gaza didn't really have an economy. It lived off of a lot of international aid donations. I mentioned this a couple of videos ago, I think multiple times, that it led to kind of weird things, like Gaza having much lower infant mortality and higher life expectancy than you would expect for how extremely poor it is, just because UNRWA would provide basic literacy, and there were hospitals that are often run by international pan-Arab, pan-Islamic charities. I should maybe say pan-Arab or pan-Islamic. Let's call them international Arab or Islamic or Muslim world charities, because I don't think that it was based on some kind of Islamist ideology, the Indonesian hospital. Maybe it was, but a lot of it is just, this is like a normal cause to contribute to Gaza and the entire Muslim world, even if you're not a pan-Arab nationalist, which at this point nobody actually is, or an Islamist. And the same kind of situation occurs in refugee camps in general. It's a little different because UNRWA is set up very differently from UNHCR, but the other example that was in my head was the Cox's Bazar refugee camps, where you have a very high density, but it's not urban. I guess maybe Cox's Bazar itself is a city, but the Rohingya refugee camps, again, there are NGOs and international organizations that are providing very basic literacy, very basic healthcare. So stuff like infant mortality there is not bad by either Bangladeshi or Burmese standards. There's no economic integration there. Again, but by any kind of modern first world standards, you can commute from the camps to Cox's Bazar. I don't want to call it downtown Cox's Bazar, but people don't do that. It's often, it says that it's prohibited, or it's prohibited for them to seek work outside the camps. It's a pretty common prohibition on refugees to integrate. So in the case of the Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, I saw a DW video maybe a year ago that went over how the education system for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh deliberately inhibits integration by forbidding to teach Bengali or forbidding to teach the Bangladeshi curriculum. They're required to teach the Burmese curriculum, so they're allowed to teach English and Burmese. I don't know if they study Rohingya formally, like Rohingya grammar or anything like that. But obviously they speak Rohingya. But they're not allowed to teach Bengali. Because that might lead to any desire to integrate, and essentially the government of Bangladesh is trying to make it so that employers are not going to say, these refugees will work for lower wages or they will work at all, and so I want to hire them for my new factory. And so they're trying to take steps to prevent the country's own capitalists from being in a position where they might want to economically integrate them into the working class through work. And so there is no economy. The other thing that I read is that in these camps are starting to develop an economy of doing some cottage industries, knitting or sewing, tote bags for like the UN to deliver to other refugee camps. But obviously that's something that you can only do in a very small proportion of the global UNHCR population. So like maybe you can make one cause celeb out of something, which the Rohingya kind of are. They are cause celebre. That level of ethnic cleansing and massacres will do that. But again, that is one refugee population, not even one refugee population, one section of the refugee population. So fundamentally, the point is that the refugee camps do not have an economy. They live off of international aid at very austere levels. We're talking severe overcrowding, and we're not talking Hong Kong overcrowding, 20 square meters per person. This is much tighter. I think Mumbai maybe is or was recently 8 per square meter, and that was considered to be inhuman overcrowding due to the combo of an urban economy and very high housing costs due to NIMBYism, and that is still much higher than you'd see in these refugee camps. And so this is also true in, let's say, Bangladesh or the Gangetic Plain in India, where you have that high, not Gaza high, but really high background rural density, but not the urbanity, by which I mean some people are urban. I mean, Dhaka is a city, Delhi is a city, you know, all these things that you see on the map are cities, you know, Kanpur, Lucknow, Calcutta, maybe Calcutta, downstream of Delhi, but this is still a majority rural area, this and this. And yeah, in India there's like a tendency of communities to want to self-define as rural for, uh, what's it called, for the subsidies, but it's still, regardless of that, a majority rural area. Um, Main urbanization in India is not Uttar Pradesh, which is very poor, or Bihar. Uh, and so it's just very high, in this case, agricultural fertility that permits uh, villages to produce food um, for themselves and for the market at very high density. But that is not urban. Again, it's not like the village. It's not like the villages are all um, one, giant sprawl where there's a lot of tight economic linkages, and and a lot of specializations of industry or consumption. No, it's much more local than that. Again, obviously not in a very large city. Again, this is not. I say this is a predominantly rural area, and this predominantly rural area has three megacities. If you count both countries, because of Delhi and Dhaka and Calcutta. But again, more than I think these three states in the country combined are 550 million people. So the presence of three very large cities is not enough to make this not predominantly rural. And the drop off in population below Delhi and Calcutta in North India is pretty steep. Uh, and so, again, this is density. This is density in the sense that the cities are very close together. It's density in the sense of very high rural density. Again, this is a matter of high agricultural fertility. India is a net exporter of food. I think Bangladesh is not, and the direction of export goes India to Bangladesh, but India plus Bangladesh, I think, still export on that. So, and by the way, the presence of food exports does not make you rural. The Netherlands is a net exporter. Israel is a net importer. I think Israel is 90% self-sufficient in calories, but net importer still. But 90% is one way of saying less than 100%, and with more detail. And so that's no, in the case of Israel, I mean, yeah, it's partly something that underlies very high agricultural fertility. But again, I mean, but it's not. It doesn't have to be. I mean, Israel has like very strong, high value added exports. Thank you very much. It's mostly tech and pharmaceuticals, and part of the global diamond trade passes through it. Like the higher value added things, like the mining is done elsewhere, but the diamond exchange is in Ramat Gan. And so the so again, you can maybe write some kind of future SF in which this is one very large city with very tight, again, economic linkages, and you can maybe build infrastructure toward that, but that's not the North India of today or the Bangladesh of today. That's not Israel ever. Again, it doesn't need to be. You do not actually need the entire country to be one city. There are economies of scale coming from that, but the economies of scale, I imagine, are logarithmic, uh, which is why it's okay for the country to have four cities. Again, maybe I should click more precisely to make clear where this, 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 uh, and it's not that fundamentally different. Like Japan and South Korea are not extremely wealthy through having megacities. I mean, yeah, they're wealthy, but they're not getting like better than America GDP per capita or GDP per hour out of this. Which you tell you that again, it's useful, but it's not of infinite usefulness, which is how in Israel, Haifa never became a Tel Aviv suburb. It doesn't need to be. Um, and in the Netherlands, cities that are outside Randstad never needed to become suburbs of Randstad. Like you don't need to commute from Groningen to Amsterdam or from Eindhoven to Amsterdam. And again, I'm sure people with like two-body problems do that, but they don't need to. Same thing with Germany and the Rhine. I mean, I'm sure there are enough commutes between adjacent cities that Dortmund to Essen should and does fuse, or Essen to Düsseldorf, Düsseldorf to Köln and so on, Köln to Bonn, obviously. But people don't need to do this commute. People don't need to commute from Bielefeld to Dortmund or from Münster to Dortmund. And so that is what I mean by density without urbanization. Again, it could be several cities, like in the case in the Netherlands or Israel, or it could be something that's not really urban, like refugee camps, like in Cox's Bazar or Gaza, or just high background rural density. And if you're thinking purely in terms of density, you will make errors. You will think a place is more developed than it actually is. Now, again, separately, you can use density to set up urbanization. It is easier to reach people when they are in very densely populated environments. The extent of state penetration in South Asia, for example, is as a result much better than in Africa. Africa has approximately the same population as India. I believe it overtook it in 2023. This is the area of the continent of Africa. And yes, some of that is the Sahara, but 30 million versus 3.3 million. India has deserts as well. The Sahara is not 8/9 of the area of Africa. So what I mean by state penetration is the villages in India are much more compact. So, for example, they're much closer to a police station. And that means that it's easier to have some kind of like formal law, whereas in Africa, again, not all of Africa, obviously, but I think Alice Evans was talking about, I'm forgetting whether she was talking about southern Africa, but north of the Kalahari, maybe Zambia, or whether she was talking about the DRC, much poorer. But with very low population density, you can have villages that are far from any state institution. So, I mean, the law can say whatever the law says. The village is governed by customary law. If the customary law says it's okay for a husband to beat his wife, which is like what she's studying, then husbands will beat their wives with impunity. And so that's also what we're seeing in refugee camps, where the population is extremely concentrated without having an economy or any kind of real urban. Maybe it's adjacent to a city, like how the refugee camps in Gaza are often adjacent to Gaza City, which is a real city. Not a very large one, but still a city. And the refugee camps in Bangladesh are technically, for the Rohingya, are technically kind of close to Cox's Bazar, like proper the city, without being economically integrated with it. Again, this is deliberate. And but because they're all in one place, it's easy for aid agencies to reach, and which I imagine is why we see that kind of very high density in refugee camps in general. It's just more convenient for UNHCR. Um, I mean, yeah, in the case of Gaza, they're just hemmed into a small polity anyway. The but they're not even taking the entire territory for it. There are gaps in urbanization. There are gaps in the built-up area in the strip. It's just, I mean, urbanization is more efficient for services reaching people, and because this is, and because refugee camps don't have an economy, nobody cares what the refugees themselves want. So maybe the refugees want more space, but who cares? The convenience of UNHCR or UNRWA is what matters when deciding how the refugees are to be, governed. And so this is where we're seeing very high, very high density. Again, this is independent of the overcrowding. You can have the overcrowding while still developing this area, for example, or developing the former Gush Katif. This gap is because there used to be settlements here, and then Sharon removed them. It's called Gush Katif, and so again, the efficiency can turn into something in the same way that, as I said, Japan and South Korea have not converged, they're not converging to American or Northern European economic productivity, but their very high levels of urbanity and economic integration between cities with infrastructure, by which I mean both very strong urban rail and suburban rail within the capital and intercity rail. These help, or also, so that and something that's not related to infrastructure, which is very high levels of education. South Korea has very high degree attainment. So these are very developmental, and that partly countermands other problems that by themselves would make them less economically productive, like the very rigid salaryman system, the one that gives both of these countries European GDP per capita for American, or for Korea worse than American working hours, or in Singapore, I think it's the same GDP per hour, maybe as Japan and South Korea, just the working hours are way more brutal. So it's American GDP per capita on way worse than America working hours. There's a lot of FaceTime culture as opposed to promotion by merit and the expectation that you work 40 hours a week with like a lot of flexibility involved. Is the one, and so so in the same way that you can have this countermanding, which again, it's what I study for a living, right? I mean, I study construction costs for subways for a living, and the best places in the world are not the highest productivity countries, not anymore. Not now that the Nordic countries decided to anglicize and increase their construction costs. So right now, where are the lowest construction costs? They're in Southern Europe, they're in Turkey, they're in the more functional parts of Latin America. Chile has very low construction costs, the Dominican Republic has very low construction costs. I'm not sure whether Korea still does or whether Korea has done the same thing as the Nordics. I don't have very good recent data for it. I will constantly tell you how there are, and not by me, not I will constantly tell everyone who studies the Italian economy will constantly tell you about all the things that are wrong with Italy and how it needs to be more like France, more like Germany, more like Scandinavia, more like the United States. But it could have certain things that it does better, and in this case, it builds infrastructure better, and in the same sense, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, through their much more concentrated urbanity, are making up for certain things, and they have, and they can maintain good economic productivity, if not German levels or Swedish levels or American levels, and in the same way, very high density without urbanization gives you the bones with which to create future urbanization. And this is something where Gaza, like a reconstructed Gaza, would just have a four-track rail line. You could just do it. You can just literally cut and cover under Saladin, and you can literally cut and cover. I'm pretty sure parts of Saladin or parallel routes have been tunneled under, so it's not like they can't do that. No, just you four-track usually. Again, it would be cut and cover just because you want to be cheap about it. Maybe you don't go on here. Maybe you go through this road because it serves Rafah better, whereas Saladin is designed to serve Rafah crossing, not Rafah city, because again, no economy, so it matters more to get to where the connection to Egypt and where the aid is delivered. So this is the main route, but in the future you go here and have a much more tightly integrated urban economy. That's again, that's easier than actually in the West Bank because in this case it's the occupation, but in general, like the weakness of the economy means that, I mean, sure, there's like some urbanization around Ramallah, but it's cut off from the main city, which is East Jerusalem, because East Jerusalem is instead integrated into West Jerusalem. And so you could try to like improve economic linkages between East Jerusalem and Ramallah and Bethlehem, but that would miss most of the West Bank. The West Bank is not especially urban. The cities are not that big. I mean, like not Jenin, Nablus, Hebron, Bethlehem, Ramallah are not together, and in Jericho, these are the main cities. They're not combined that much of a share of the population of the West Bank at East Jerusalem. Just for example, where you could use high density to your advantage, and the same is true, of course, in India and Bangladesh for rail development. The locations of the cities in India and Bangladesh are kind of terrible for any kind of rail development. Like they're at the wrong distances from each other. Like Delhi to Calcutta is frustratingly long. Like yes, you can do a Chinese high speed train, maybe, possibly do it in 5 hours. I don't see it done in summer. And then through them you can serve Kanpur or Lucknow, but it's not easy to serve both of them combined on the same line, so you pick one and then put the other on a branch. And then maybe you go through mainly through Varanasi, and then Patna is not quite on the straight line, so you need to deviate a little bit. And like somehow the cities are never especially collinear, and likewise in Bangladesh, it's a little bit Spanish style in which the cities have absolutely no structure to where they're located. So Dhaka, Chittagong says Chattogram, and then I think the third and fourth cities are Khulna and Sylhet. So literally any second city, any major provincial city would need its own dedicated route into Dhaka. Nothing is collinear. And now, still, you can use a very high density to your advantage because even with a terrible distribution, it's dense enough that, okay, you can just build all of these lines out, and maybe even something cross-country, and still make it work. And then, I didn't talk about the other examples of density without urbanization, but as Honorable mentions, Jawa. Kind of weird to say without urbanization because Jakarta is fucking huge. But Jawa is about 1,000 per square kilometer, the entire island, and again, it's not meaningfully one city, but in the future, in Indonesia that had better intercity rail than what it's doing with Chinese high-speed rail, in this case, it needs better connectivity and density. This is not where you need to go nuts on speed. So you'd go Jakarta to Bandung, which is what they're building, and then go back to the coast and serve all these little cities on your way to Surabaya. And on your way to Surabaya, you can like create this into much more tightly interlinked cities, and make this a more, maybe not metropolitan, but megalopolitan region, like Boston to Washington. Um, and same thing with Egypt. Very high density along the Nile, just very high very high agricultural productivity, thanks to the Nile floods and and the sediments. So the green parts of Egypt are very dense, and there's basically no development in the desert unless it is adjacent to Cairo, just because Cairo is big enough that it can drive extensive suburbanization into the desert. Like you can see it in here, for example, or the or New Cairo, or the new administrative capital, um, and but setting aside the fact that like the new administrative capital should be cancelled, um, and Sisi should also be cancelled and be thrown to prison or shot. Um, but but in Egypt, one of their infrastructure priorities should be to turn this into a rail line, to use this linearity, even so this high density without urbanization. Like these are not. This is a majority rural area, but because these little cities are all along one line, connect them to each other, to kind of form more agglomeration, and then more people would commute to them through better economies that they would get through these connections, turn them into more provincial connections. As they do like provincial centers with connections to Cairo, and of course in Lower Egypt it's very dense without that linearity, but Alexandria exists. And So again, all of these are density without urbanization. Again, not without. Cairo exists, Jakarta exists, just this is not one linear city, and it could be turned into one. So density could be used to facilitate urbanization if the cities are closer together. Again, maybe not again because I don't think I've said this before on stream, but I've said this on my blog a bunch. If the cities are closer together, that is when intercity rail does better, especially low-speed intercity rail, because there are a bunch of cities that it stops on the way. Oh wait, you're asking me about Jake. You're asking me about Mumbai to Delhi. Mumbai to Delhi is also quite a ways away. So this is something that again is not maybe. This is something that is not as long as Delhi to Calcutta, but it's still pretty long. And yeah, there are deviations. If you do something like this, I don't think the plan is to serve Jaipurs. I think they're going through Jaipur instead. This is something that, I mean, they're doing Turkey Shinkansen, and it's not as straight as I'm drawing it. So it's not going to be. It's something that in theory could be done in 4 hours, but probably will be more like 4.5, 5. And that's not terrible. And the fact that Surat and Ahmedabad are kind of collinear with it is kind of nice. But the top 4 cities, New Delhi, Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, and Chennai. Number 5 and 6 are Hyderabad and Bangalore. So, yes, Hyderabad and Bangalore are both between Mumbai and Chennai, but it's pick one, XOR the other. And then the cities, and then yes, these are 7 and 8. I think 9 and 10 are Lucknow and Kanpur. Then there are all the others that are, again, pretty random locations, like Indore and Bhopal, like if you're trying to serve Madhya Pradesh, or Pune is top 10 as well. Pune, I guess I can put on the way between Mumbai and Bangalore. And then, what else is there? Nashik? No, the line is going to go straight north to Surat. like you can do what, a line, not like an intra-Maharashtra line, but the intra-Maharashtra line is not going to serve Pune because it's going to go, it's a mess. Again, it's a mess that they can do because it's a big country and it should have the ability to afford, you know, comparable scale of high-speed rail to China, which has a very large system. Like if you, like China is what, 25,000 square kilometers, no, sorry, it's what, okay, 45,000 square kilometers, not square, 45,000 kilometers. I'm not sure how many of them are high speed as opposed to medium speed. Um, uh, okay, so let's not do the ones that are 250. Also, I'm pretty sure this is a partial list. Yeah, this is a very partial list. I don't know what proportion is 350 as opposed to 250. I can ask. But I can ask, I mean, it's already here. So, 3, 5, 7.5. No, this is 250. 5 point something. This would be 6.5. 7, maybe 9. Wait, that's still very partial. Anyway, so maybe it's predominantly 250 and I'm wrong, but I thought this was like something like 15,000 or 20,000 of 300 plus. And if that's the budget for India, again, it's easy. India is much denser than China. Like India recently overtook China's population and is 1/3 the size. I mean, it's much closer if from China you exclude Xinjiang, Tibet, Qinghai, and so on. But they are actually building a high-speed line to Urumqi in order to like stake a claim. So again, you can, density does not mean urbanization, but it can facilitate this kind of urban and metropolitan and megalopolitan infrastructure later, but that still needs to be built, is the point. And yeah, that was my main point, just that high density does not need to mean urbanization. It could be rural, it could be, in the case of the Netherlands, a bunch of small cities that are close together, which again could be linked with rail and create a more integrated economy, but would still not be one metropolis. I will take questions if people have them, and then we can make it a short video. I say short, and then we're like close to an hour 10 of recording. Like short in YouTube means 1 minute. Then usually the vloggers that are not doing shorts, these are the ones that I watch that are not doing gaming. They would start out as like digestible 3, 5, maybe 7-minute videos, and then as they build up an audience, they would make longer videos. I think Lindsay Ellis was 10 to 15-minute videos, and then started getting longer as she got more independent and got more of an established audience. And then, of course, quit YouTube. Great, 10 minutes, not 10 minutes, 10 seconds of 10 seconds of lag. I can wait like a little bit and then do a last call. Like I don't know if Hikoki is here, but if you are, let me know, so that just because I know that you take a while to type. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say, just because I'm just for completionism. I gave the examples of Egypt up the Nile and the northern coast of Java with a detour for Bandung as examples of linearity facilitating high-speed rail infrastructure. Pakistan is a semi-decent example of that as well, because most of the country is near a single rail line, which is very slow, which goes something like this. Kind of like up the Indus, and this is a much lower density environment than India, by which I mean it's only like 200 something per square kilometer, so it's still dense for a country. I think it goes something like this, the main line. And again, maybe it's not like this, maybe Faisalabad is on it. It's the third city of Pakistan. Now, the thing is, this is pretty long, and even if you delete the extras, and extras means anything north of Lahore, including in particular the capital, this is pretty awkward. This is Karachi to Lahore would be 4 hours, and they would probably do it Chinese style, so 4 hours, but the stations would be like fucking Jahannam. And but it's something where you can again use density to your advantage, and this is like, I don't think it's the main cause for why South Asia has better development than Africa between the Sahara and the Kalahari, because for example Nigeria has that density as well, and yeah, it has higher GDP per capita, but a lot of it is oil. The overall like living standards are much lower than in South Asia, but I think it does contribute. Like I think it does contribute that South Asia is doing is doing better, because just the density does not come with urbanization, but again, it makes it easier. It makes it easier to build this kind of infrastructure. And again, it's going to be the same in Nigeria, which just has way more messed up infrastructure than Pakistan, for example. I'm going to do one last call for questions, and then if people don't have further questions, we can break. I know that this is not my usual fare, and you can see this in the viewer numbers, but I thought it was kind of important to say, because, I mean, I think people following on social media know that I, like, do is-explaining on Mastodon and Blitzcolumn, where they write about trains on social media. I still write about trains, of course, I blog about trains, but and just to be clear, is-explaining is not like me calculating the word hasbara, which kind of it does mean explaining, like literally. No, I mean just saying just very basic things about Israel that like are not even the pro-Israel narrative won't tell you X, or the pro-Palestine narrative won't tell you Y. It's things that are like pretty orthogonal very often. And yeah, one of it is that I think people overrate the urbanity of the Strip. And so I thought it was important to talk about the issue of how there is a lot of density there, and again, I give other examples, but it doesn't make it any kind of contiguous urbanization. The Gaza Strip is not a city of 2.2 million people that is, currently being invaded under war. It is a city of, I think, maybe 300 or 400,000, with a lot of with like some smaller cities, a lot of refugee camps in between that have very high density without the trappings that one would expect of a city region of 2 million people. And yeah, so thank you all for watching, and I will see you once again in the next one, maybe in a week, maybe on Tuesday. Probably will be spaced in a way that I don't need to stream in 2 weeks, because I'm flying in 2 weeks. I'm gonna be in the US between the 14th of June and the 4th of July. So um, I will stream from there at the same time. So 7 Germany time, 1 Eastern US time, but not in 2 weeks. No, I have other commitments. So thank you all, and actually maybe the commitment in 2 weeks is later than that, so maybe we'll see. So anyway, thank you, and ciao ciao.